moving into chapter 6, as I said, we're going to be talking about memory. Now, we've already done a lot of things that kind of led up to what are the different sensations and how do we perceive them. And now we're moving into the part of the part of the textbook, which is talking about how that information is put into our brains, how is it stored in there, and how do we retrieve it. This is a basic preview for what we're going to be covering in the chapter. So first we're going to talk about what memory is, what are some of the basic components to it, and with regards to encoding, what does that even mean, storage, retrieval. With regards to storage, we're going to talk about long-term versus short-term, and then retrieval. How do we actually get the information that we have in our brain, and how do we retrieve it in a way in which we can remember everything that we've accomplished or everything that we've experienced. Okay, and then finally we'll get to some different memory strategies that we can use, and also applying more scientific methods to our life with regards to memory. So something like eyewitness testimony, we'll talk about amnesia, and all those more interesting aspects to memory development. So before we actually talk about that, we need to figure out what memory is. Memory is the retention of information that we experience over time. Okay? The fact that you can remember what you did this past weekend, it's a retention of that memory. It's something that's maybe important to you, and so you want to remember it over the long term. The fact that we just have survived a hurricane, that is something that you're probably going to remember for the rest of your life. And if someone were to ask you, you would be able to retrieve that information. Now, how does that information actually get into our brain? First, it goes through a process of encoding. And this is a cognitive process that we need to apply attention and associative properties to in order to bring the knowledge from outside in the environment through our sensory organs for our brain to interpret so that we would understand it and make it easier to be remembered. Okay? If you've ever done computer programming, or you have to write code for something, this is what we would call encoding. We have to organize information in such a way so that it can go into our brain, so that in the future we'll hopefully be able to take it back out and understand it or send the information to somebody else. So encoding is the first and main thing that our brain is going to have to do. The second thing is storing the information. Great, we can get the information, we can understand it, it gets inside of our head, but if we don't have a place to store that information, then we're not going to be able to remember it for the future. Okay, and that's where we have our long and our short-term storage. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later on. The last thing that our brain does, which is so important for memory, is of course retrieving the information. So the information has to be pertinent to us in some way for us to pay attention to it, encode it, and have it go into our brain like a little filing cabinet. We store it for future use, and then when the time comes that someone says something to us, jogs our memory to remember something, we go back into that file cabinet and we can retrieve that information and then use it for whatever use we're trying to do. Okay? Now, memory encoding alone, when we talk about that, we're talking about the process in which information enters our memory storage. So how does that information actually get into our brain? Some information enters automatically, whereas other information requires some effort. The automatic information might be stuff that's very easy for us to learn. For example, say you were really good at math, or you're really good at remembering facts in history class. Well, that information enters your brain and is encoded automatically. It's very quick, doesn't take a whole lot of effort. it is essentially something that's just easy for you to understand. On the other hand, there's information that might require a lot of effort. It's like the difference between certain subjects or topics that you are studying. Sometimes you need to spend only an hour on this particular subject, and then you're fine and you understand everything. Versus other times where maybe you have to spend 2 or 3 hours because it takes you longer to understand the material and really figure out what's going on. We also need to pay attention to what it is that we are actually looking at or understanding about the world. And with attention, we can have 2 different types. We can either have selective attention, in which we focus on very specific things about the environment while we ignore others. Okay? And perhaps a reason why we do this is because we have a limitation in our brain resources. We don't have the capability to pay attention to all different things at the same time. So we only pay attention to the things that are going to be most important to us. So if you remember back when I was talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic system, and you're walking through that dark alley and your responding is becoming heightened, well, you're going to be selectively attending. You're going to be paying more attention to the corner up ahead, to the sounds that are going on around you, because those things are more important versus what color your shoes are, right? The second type of attention we can have is what's called divided attention. So we can either selectively attend or focus on specific things, or we can divide our attention among several things and do them simultaneously. This would be like, you drove to school today. Not only were you driving, but you were listening to the radio, you were talking on the phone, you were eating a banana, you were doing whatever. You're doing all of these different things at the same time, and you are still maintaining enough attention to get each of those tasks completed. Okay? And we also can call that multitasking. Now, the other thing we have is what's called deep processing, and here we have a nice slide here, and this is actually, you can find this in your textbook. We have 3 different levels in which processing can occur, and the depth at which that can occur. If we are first learning something, we typically are just using shallow processing, where we just kind of look at it very quickly. We don't really pay too much attention in terms of the details and things like that. We just look at it very superficially. It'd be like I ask a question like, what color's the sky? The sky's blue on nice days. The sky's gray on rainy days, right? And then just leaving it there. Now, what if I wanted to learn a little bit more? Then I would do more intermediate processing, where perhaps I will actually figure out, why is the sky blue? Oh, because of the way the light hits the things, the way the light is entering into my eyes, the wavelengths. Okay, intermediate processing. Now, perhaps I want to learn even more. So I want to learn what those wavelengths are. I want to learn how do these different things interact. Is there something else in the atmosphere that causes the sky to be blue? That's when I'm going into deeper processing, okay? So I'm thinking about it in a much more meaningful way, as opposed to, what color is the sky? Oh, it's blue, okay? So depth of processing is going to be important, and the deeper your processing is, the better that memory is going to be encoded. We also have elaboration, where we can create different connections around a stimulus, and this will allow us to have varying levels of encoding as well. So it's like, I talk about this party that I went to this weekend, and you tell me, oh, you went to a party this weekend? That reminds me of this other party we had. It reminds me of the time that we went to my grandma's house and we had a birthday party for her. All right. So we can have a very specific memory, But then we can connect that with other memories and create a much richer picture of what it is that we're actually remembering and what that information is that we are encoding. And lastly, we can use mental imagery, where we actually visualize what has happened in order to remember the details. So if you were in an accident and someone asks you, oh, what happened? You might need to visualize in order to remember, well, I was driving down this road and then this deer came out in front of me and it had big horns. I wasn't going very fast, but then it came running and it barreled into the side of my door. All right, you're using mental imagery. Although that memory has been encoded, you can come up with a visual representation of what actually happened, and that allows it to be encoded better and also potentially remembered for longer. Okay, so memory encoding is important. We also need to be able to store that information. We have 3 types of storage units, we could say. We have a storage unit for sensory memory, which is very short and fleeting. In other words, sensory memory comes and goes very quickly. Within a few seconds, we don't even think about it anymore. It's come and gone. Right? An example that I gave in class on Tuesday was you go to the window, you open the window, and all of a sudden a big gust of wind comes in and you're cold. You're like, oh, it's cold outside. You close your window, and that sensory memory of it being cold is the first type of memory storage that you can have. So the cold feeling is a sensory memory. Now, if you weren't going to do anything about it and you're going to stay in for the rest of the day, then perhaps you don't even think about it being cold outside anymore. On the other hand, perhaps you have to go to school that day. You open the window, it's cold, and then you close the window and you go into your closet and you open up your closet and you're taking that little bit of sensory memory, which is now moving into your short-term memory, because you're going to need it in order to pick out what kind of clothes you're going to wear so that you're not cold for the rest of the day, right? So short-term memory is the second form of memory. Short-term memory is for information that you need to know at this very specific moment. When you're doing things, when you're sitting and you're listening to this recording right now, you're using short-term memory in order to understand what you are listening to and viewing the screen. Now, if the information is important enough, then it will be moved into long-term memory, okay? And once it moves into long-term memory, these are memories that are relatively permanent, and they're memories that you might bring back up after long periods of time, okay? So we have our sensory memory, which hold information in sensory form for an instant, and it can be very rich with detail, but it doesn't last very long. Now, if it's important, it'll be moved into short or long-term memory store, but if it's not important, then it will just disappear. We have 2 subtypes of sensory memory: echoic memory and iconic. Now, echoic and iconic are important for either auditory or visual sensory information. Okay, so echoic, you can think of echoes, sounds. That is going to be something that's going to be very important, and it's going to be very important in helping us remember things. What did we hear? What did something sound like? That is engaging your echoic memory. Iconic memory is using the visual stimulation and using that to form a visual memory of something. So what did it look like? What color was it? Did you see one person or 2 people? Okay, so echoic and iconic are important within the sensory memory realm, where we're getting information very quickly. It might be very rich with detail, but it's going to be fleeting. It's not going to last very long, and so unless it's important, it's not going to move into the short or long-term memory store. Now, say the information is important enough. Then it moves into our short-term or working memory. Okay, short-term and working memory are synonymous with each other. You can use them interchangeably. There are three basic components to our short-term or our working memory. The first being what's called a phonological loop. This is when you are briefly storing speech-based information. So right now you're listening to me, you're listening to what I have to say. This is engaging the phonological loop in your working memory, where you are listening and you're trying to understand, and hopefully some of what I'm saying, perhaps the examples that I give you, are going to be things that are going to hopefully move into your long-term memory store so that you will remember this information. The second important system to short-term and working memory is the visual spatial working memory. Now this is important because it's storing visual as well as spatial information. So the information that you need to know about what something looks like, where is something in relation to where you are, that is all going to be engaging your visual spatial working memory. And that is also important. For example, if I ask you, where is our classroom in relation to the student center, you are going to be engaging your visual spatial working memory in order to come up with the answer for that. You will also be using your phonological loop because you can understand the question that I'm asking, and you need to remember the question so that you can look through your visual spatial working memory in order to find out what the answer is. The last component of your short-term and working memory is the central executive area, and this will integrate information of the phonological as well as the visual spatial working memory, combine them together in such a way that we can then organize the memory that we are trying to understand and potentially move that memory into a long-term memory solution. Okay, so working memory, we're using it right at this very moment. You typically use your working or short-term memory when you're doing all the different tasks that you do throughout the day. You engage that working memory when you go to the bathroom and you brush your teeth, because you need to remember how to brush your teeth. You're engaging that memory when you get into your car to go driving someplace. You're engaging that memory when you're walking to class so that you know which classroom to walk into, which chair to sit at. So you do use it on a daily basis in order to get day-to-day things completed. Now, in addition, short-term and working memory, there are some things that we can do to potentially improve that memory. And we can do this through two different procedures. We can do chunking or rehearsal. Chunking is where we group information that we are hearing or that we are understanding into smaller single units. And when we group them into smaller single units, then it's easier for us to remember. So for example, if you look at a person's phone number, nowadays we have the technology where the phone numbers, we can just click on the person's name, we can put them on speed dial, so we don't actually have to remember their phone number. But there was a time when we did have to remember phone numbers, and we didn't have the beauty of technology to be able to just look it up. And the great thing about phone numbers is that they're grouped in such a way that there are, aside from the area code, the first 3 digits are together, and then the last 4 digits are together. Now, because they're grouped like that, it makes it a whole lot easier to remember 7 numbers. Now you're remembering 2 chunks of numbers, 3 numbers here, 4 numbers there, and it's very, it allows you to remember a lot more information, even though it might be the same number before and after. Okay? Now, before we talk about rehearsals, here's a perfect example of chunking. Okay? So here I have a list of letters up there. All right? They're grouped in different ways, but what I'd like you to do is maybe just take the next 15 seconds to look at these letters and see how many you can remember. Okay? So it's going to be silent, and I'll let you do this exercise. Okay, now I want you to try and write down as many of those letters as you remember. Great. Now, here's our list of letters again. How many of these did you remember? Now, you might notice that you don't remember a whole lot of them, but perhaps if you looked at this series of letters a little bit more carefully, you'll notice something about them. They're chunked differently from how we would potentially chunk them. If you notice at the list of letters, you can actually chunk them different to remember them better by chunking them into CIA, FBI, KGB, DNA, BBC, UK, CNN, and USA. Now, if they were chunked in that way, you would probably remember more of those letters as opposed to the way that they're chunked now. Okay? Here's another example. Here's a list of words. I'll give you the next 15 seconds to look over these words. Okay, and now write as many of those words as you can remember. Alright, so here's our list of words again, and you can determine for yourself how many of these words you actually remembered. Perhaps you remembered 5, maybe you even remembered 10. I think there were some people in our class that remembered up to 13 or 14 of these words. Okay? Now, it doesn't really matter how many words you remember, but if I give you this next list of words, again, I want you to take a few seconds here to look at them and try and write down as many words as you can after the time allotted. So here's our next list of words. Okay, so again, write down as many of those words as you remember. Okay, so here is our last set of words, and you'll notice perhaps that you were able to remember more of these words than the first list. Now, why is that? If you take a close look at the words, you'll notice that they are chunked in very specific ways. The first row at the top is types of animals. The second row are colors, and the last row are things in a dorm room or in your house, okay? So because we chunk them in a very specific way, we're able to remember a lot more of these words as opposed to the previous list where they were all jumbled up and there was all different types of words mixed in, okay? So we can do chunking, a very nice way in order to try and remember more information by simply grouping them into smaller units and making them easier to remember. The other way that we can improve short-term memory is through rehearsal. And you were probably using some of the rehearsal piece when you were trying to look at the list of words in order to remember the different words that they were there. But we can use rehearsal as another way in which to try and remember through continuous repetition of the information that we are seeing. Here is a depiction of how working memory is categorized or put together in our brain. This is also in your textbook. You can see that the visuospatial and the phonological loop are both combining together into the central executive area. And of course, we have inputs that are coming from our sensory memory system. And then if the information is important enough for us to remember, it will hopefully move into our long-term store. Lastly, we have long-term memory. Long-term memory is the relatively permanent memory that I mentioned before, and it stores huge amounts of information for an extremely long period of time. Now, the fact of the matter is you won't ever really know what is in your long-term memory unless somebody asks you a specific question for you to dredge up things from your long-term memory. Now, there's two types of long-term memory. We either have explicit memory, which is essentially information that we can verbally communicate. Explicit memory is divided into episodic memory, which is primarily memory about our autobiographical events, so the time, places, emotions, those kind of things that are associated with something very specific that happened in our life. For example, if you think about what did you do over the weekend, what did you do this past week, perhaps many of you were stuck in the hurricane and you were stuck in the dark. So you remember that event. You remember where you were. You remember the time, perhaps, of when the electricity went out. So these are pieces of information that you can verbally communicate to somebody, but they're related to the autobiographical information about yourself. We also have what's called semantic memory, and this refers to memory of meaning and understanding, and they're more concept-based knowledge. So this is information that's not necessarily associated with who you are, but it's associated with what you know. For example, who's the first president of the United States? Well, the first person of the United States is George Washington. Now, if I were to ask you, when did you learn that information? Many of you would probably not be able to tell me exactly when you learned it, at what time you learned it, where were you when you learned that, okay? Now, if you could, then it would have been significant enough for you to put it into your episodic memory, but for the most part, some of this factual information, we don't know when we learned it. We just know that it's true and that we have learned it at some point in time, okay? So explicit memory, we have information that can be verbally communicated. That information is either autobiographical events through episodic memory, or they are memory for factual information, which is semantic. The other type of memory that we have within the long-term memory store is implicit memory, and this is behavior that's affected by a prior experience with conscious recollection. So this goes along with a few different kinds. We have procedural memory, where we just have a memory for a skill. For example, typing. When we type something up, we typically don't have to look at the keys in order to type something. If you're very good at typing and you know where all of the keys are, then you could just very easily just look at the paper that you're trying to type, and you won't ever have to look at the keys. Now, it's a memory for a skill, it's a behavior that you've done, and you might not exactly remember when you learned it, but it's a skill that you have been able to have based on prior experience with it. Classical conditioning is also a form of implicit memory where automatic responses are going to prevail in that. And if you remember, we talked about latent or implicit memory. The big difference between implicit memory or learning, implicit learning and imitation is that with implicit learning, we're more focused on the cognitive process behind why we do something. So we didn't actually receive reinforcement. If you remember the experiment I told you with the rats and how one rat was paralyzed but then was dragged through the maze, and the other rat may have made some wrong turns here and there, but finally gets out at the end and gets a cheese, but the other rat doesn't get it. Now, what is the incentive for that rat to go through that maze? Not much incentive, because first off, they saw a lot of wrong turns, and secondly, they didn't get reinforced for it. And so in that sense, they need to cognitively decide whether or not it's a good enough reason or a good enough incentive to go ahead and do that behavior, versus imitation, where we can see it right away and we go ahead and we just imitate that behavior without using as much cognitive ability to understand what's going on. And the last thing involved with implicit memory is priming, in which we activate information that's in our storage unit in order to help somebody remember. So perhaps we ask certain key questions in order to prime somebody so that they will hopefully remember something as well. Okay? And here you can see a nice pictorial of what the long-term memory store looks like and how it's divided up. Okay, this is also in your textbook, so you shouldn't have any problem